Chapter 4.6, we're going to talk about the connections between cells and how they influence some cellular activities. So we need to first talk about extracellular matrix. We'll talk about this in the context of animal cells primarily. We'll look at some ways that plant cells and animal cells can communicate with adjacent cells, although we'll talk more about this in detail in Chapter 9. And then we will talk about some of the junctions that can occur between cells to not only attach cells together, but allow some of this communication to occur. So, the big questions, right? How do cells hold together and not just fall apart? And then how do they talk to one another? Because if you're a multicellular organism, your cells have to talk, right? You have to have one cell that says, hey, I'm going to become a skin cell. You become a muscle cell instead, right? I'll do this job, you do that job. Or, hey, I'm a skin cell. You should also become a skin cell so we can form a protective barrier, right? Cells have to talk. That's a simplification of it, but at the core, they got to talk to one another. To do that, we need some molecules to help connect cells and allow communication. In animals, we have this thing called the extracellular matrix, not that matrix as in a connection of things. And in this case, it's a connection of proteins and proteoglycans, which is a mix of protein and carbohydrate. So you can see the protein attached to carbohydrate, right? We have this whole bunch of fibers like collagen here and fibronectin that help connect this extracellular matrix with the cell itself. So here's our plasma membrane, here's our cytoplasm inside, and here's the extracellular matrix. This holds cells together to form tissues, so they kind of help stick together. This one would interlock a little bit with the extracellular matrix of another cell. It also allows communication between them. These things can interact with one another. You might not think of carbohydrates as being a message, but they can be, depending on what they interact with. Also, blood clotting utilizes this extracellular matrix to help bring in platelets and block up blood vessels, causing the blood vessels to contract. So this extracellular matrix has a lot of functions. It's going to vary by tissue and things like that, but broadly it is out there outside of animal cells. But what about plant cells? They're a little bit different. Plant cells have the cell wall, so we don't really have an extracellular matrix outside of plant cells. Instead, they often connect between the cell walls, but that causes a problem, right? The cell wall is this big rigid barrier. How does stuff move from one cell to another? We have to move lots of things. Water is a big one. Nutrients, signaling molecules. How do we move that? Well, this is where a type of junction called Plasmodesmata comes into play. Plasmodesmata are just little holes between the cell walls of plants that allow them to move things from one to another. That's as deep as we're going to go on that. Just know Plasmodesmata connect plant cells together. We're going to go back to animal cells now. And let's talk about animal junctions between cells. So we said that extracellular matrix can kind of loosely hold cells together. But what about when we need cells to be really tightly joined together? There's a lot of places that you might need this. Okay? Places we want to form a watertight seal. Your skin, for instance. You really don't want the water escaping out of your skin, right? You don't want fluid leaking out of your body. You work hard to get that fluid. You don't want it to go away. Also, in the enteric tract, the gastrointestinal tract, right? You want to regulate what gets into the body and out of the body. You have a tube in you, right? And you eat stuff. Sometimes microbes come in there. We really don't want those microbes getting into the rest of our body. So we force things to move through our cells, and that kind of filters them. To do that, we need watertight junctions, because otherwise things could just slip in between the gap between cells. This is where tight junctions come in. Tight junctions are watertight junctions between animal cells. They seal them together. Here, we're zoomed in on the top of some epithelial cells. We have proteins that hold that junction together and are watertight. Keeps things from leaking into or out of the gap between cells. Mainly, we're keeping pathogens out, right? We don't want bacteria to get in between that junction into the rest of the body. That would evade a lot of our immune system. Okay, so that's where we need waterproofing, real tight junctions. At other locations, we might need to hold the cells together, but not in a watertight manner. This is where desmosomes come in. Desmosomes are made up of intermediate filaments. So this is going to happen in animals, not plants. And the desmosomes, they can form a junction here between the two cells that just help keep the cells adjacent to one another. And they are not watertight, though. They're just holding them together pretty firmly, but not watertight. There are other cases when, like in plant cells, we want to move stuff directly from one cell to another. In animals, this occurs through what we call gap junctions. Gap junctions are a joint that occurs where we have proteins called connexins that form basically a tube between the two cells. And that allows nutrients, ions, other signaling molecules or communication molecules to move through there. It also allows electrical signals for muscles to pass through. So many functions here. Again, if you go on to take cell biology, you'll learn more about these and their specializations in different cell types. But very, very important that we have ways of holding cells together and moving things between them. Okay, so to sum it up, animals use that extracellular matrix of proteins and sugar to help communicate and hold their cells together loosely. Animal cells are held together in a waterproof manner by what we call tight junctions. If we just need to hold the cells together, don't need it to be watertight. Desmosomes do that. They're made up of intermediate filaments. And then we have gap junctions that can allow for molecules to flow between animal cells. In plants, we have the cell wall, so we have a term called Plasmodesmata that basically is a gap between the cell walls and the cell membranes that allows substances to flow between them. Right, before we finish up, I want to do one last review question here. Order the cytoskeleton components based on their size from largest to smallest here. Okay, you got 4 different options. Go ahead and pause the video. Think about these, order them, and we'll come back and talk about it. We could start with the biggest thing. We could start with the smallest thing. Or if you're clever, you could start with the intermediate thing. You're probably a safe bet that intermediate goes in the middle. So that narrows it down to 2 here. So then we got these options here between microtubules and microfilaments here. Microtubules are the largest, so they should come first. Microfilaments are the smallest, they're last. So the answer would be C, microtubules, intermediate filaments, microfilaments. You could also think about it the other way around, which is the largest. If you remember that, microtubules, then that leaves, just which is intermediate and which is smallest. Another way of thinking about it. Okay, that does it for chapter 4. In chapter 5, we're going to talk all about membranes because membranes are super important in terms of keeping things in, keeping things out, letting things in, letting things out of the cell.